Welcome to the Quillette podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Kay, a senior editor at Quillette. Quillette is where free thought lives. We are an independent grassroots platform for heterodox ideas and fearless commentary. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can do so by going to quillette.com and becoming a paid subscriber. This subscription will also give you access to all our articles and early access to Quillette social events.
Hi, I'm Toby Young, one of Quillette's London-based editors. Last week, the conservative philosopher Sir Roger Scruton was fired as an advisor to the British government after giving an interview to a left-wing magazine in which he made a number of supposedly offensive remarks about China, George Soros, and Muslim immigration to Hungary. I visited Sir Roger at his farmhouse in Wiltshire and asked him about these comments, as well as the implications his firing has for intellectual freedom more widely.
Last week you were sacked from your job as chairman of Building Better, Building Beautiful, which was a commission established by the government to improve the design of new homes, villages and towns. How was the news of your defenestration conveyed to you?
I was coming back from Paris, where I was giving an interview on a French edition of one of my books for France Culture. Got onto the Eurostar and rang home to see how everything was, and was told then by Izzy, my secretary, that this had happened. And that was it. I didn't receive any official notification later, and nobody's ever told me the reasons why. There have been all kinds of things said, but that's rather different.
Did they at least contact Izzy first to try and notify her that the government was about to make this announcement so you wouldn't hear about it over the airwaves or on Twitter?
If they did, I didn't know that.
Okay. So ostensibly the reason you were sacked is because in an interview with George Eaton, the political editor of The New Statesman, which is a left-wing weekly, you made comments that were, according to a spokesman for the Prime Minister, quote, deeply offensive and completely unacceptable, unquote. So there were 4 comments that appear to have sealed your fate, all of them published by George Eaton in a Twitter thread 2 days before the interview appeared on the newsstands. And I'd like to take each of them in turn, if possible. So the first was about George Soros. You said, and this was the quote that George Eaton put on Twitter, I don't know whether it was taken out of context or not. You said, anybody who doesn't think that there's a Soros empire in Hungary has not observed the facts. And according to your critics, regardless of the extent of Soros's commercial and charitable activities in Hungary, you must have been aware when you said that and used the phrase Soros's empire that you were trafficking in an anti-Semitic trope, portraying Soros as a sort of typical Jewish puppet master. What do you say to that?
Well, it's false. I mean, he has a big empire of NGOs and institutions, human rights type institutions, and of course the Central European University, which are largely devoted to undoing the work of the Hungarian government in trying to protect itself from mass migration and absorption into the whole melting pot that Europe is becoming. And because he is ideologically very, very convinced that the open society requires open borders, and this, for the Hungarians, is unacceptable. And the institutions that he's founded there, he does certainly use in order to promote this goal.
And you weren't concerned that using the phrase Soros's empire, you were, in a sense, giving intellectual cover, a kind of legitimacy to anti-Semites who use that phrase with a different agenda?
Well, I made it absolutely clear in my original remarks that this has nothing to do with the anti-Semitism agenda. I expressly said, this was in Hungary when I was talking about the nation and nationalism, that Hungarian Jews are rightly, many of them rightly suspicious of nationalism because of what they've suffered from it. Maybe I didn't use the exactly right words that I should have used, but I tried to say that there is this huge conflict that is coming to the surface again. How careful does one have to be? And lots of people have empires of influence, only if you explicitly say that they have this empire of influence because they're Jews, can you possibly have been taken to have made an anti-Semitic remark. As far as I'm concerned, Soros's interests are as a Hungarian, not as a Jew, in all this political matter.
And you've stuck up for the Central European University and intervened with Orban to try and dissuade him from trying to close it.
Yeah. Yes. When he started this, I made a big effort. I went to Hungary, more or less, especially to try and see him, and made the case, saying it was very bad for Hungary to close this down, and also bad for the international network which is growing in the university world, which is now including Hungary, largely thanks to the Central European University, and he should be proud of this. Didn't make any difference, and that's true. Although he did, at the time, say, yes, well, I'll give this serious thought, and I think it's going to be okay.
Your second remark that I think the Prime Minister was referring to as offensive and unacceptable was allegedly a racist reference to Chinese people. And we do know now that this was taken out of context, but what George Eaton, in his Twitter thread on last Tuesday, quoted you as saying was, each Chinese person is a kind of replica of the next one, and that is a very frightening thing, unquote. And your critics say you were invoking a racist stereotype about Chinese people, that they all look and behave the same.
There's a phrase missing from the quote,
yes,
in which I point out that this is what the Chinese government is trying to make them. And I was arguing about, as I explained in my reply, about the robotization of Chinese society by the Communist Party. And anybody who denies that also has not observed the facts. I can't see what you can do about this if people want to read into it some kind of racist demonology, then they can. That's their problem.
Your third sin was to describe Islamophobia as a propaganda word invented by the Muslim Brotherhood in order to stop discussion of a major issue. And your critics would say that even if that's true, Islamophobia is nonetheless real, in that some people do suffer from an irrational fear of Muslims, and by describing Islamophobia as a propaganda word, you were effectively saying that no such irrational fear exists. And this brings us to your fourth comment, which George Eaton tweeted out, whereby you compounded this impression, at least in the eyes of your critics, by adding that the electoral success of Orban was due to high levels of Muslim immigration. And you said, quote, the Hungarians were extremely alarmed by the sudden invasion of huge tribes of Muslims from the Middle East. And people took particular exception, or your critics took particular exception to your use of the word tribes, which they claim suggests that Muslim migrants are primitive, even dangerous, and that you were, in effect, being Islamophobic, both by denying that there was such a thing, or that we should be concerned about Islamophobia, and by using the word tribes to describe large numbers of Muslim immigrants.
In retrospect, it was a mistake to use the word tribes, although, of course, the Middle Eastern Muslims do belong to a tribal culture, and that's how they divide it into sects in that way, and I don't see anything wrong with that. I was referring to the fact, there were something like 350,000 illegal immigrants suddenly rushed into Hungary which has a population of 11 million. It's not surprising if they felt that they were being invaded. And that was what I was trying to point out, is that Viktor Orban's policies were partly a response to that fact. He couldn't do nothing, and the Hungarians wanted him to affirm their national identity against this. And it was, and of course Merkel's invitation to people to come into Germany was extremely destructive for Hungary because that was the way they came.
What about the idea that Islamophobia has been essentially confected for propaganda purposes, and that there's not and that people in the West and elsewhere don't really suffer from an irrational fear of Islam?
We have a lot of irrational fears. Some people have irrational fears of Christianity and so on. The point that I would make is that the word phobia suggests some pathological condition rather than a reasoned response. And what is needed in this issue is a reasoned response. And that means listening to people who reason in such a way as to come up with the opposite conclusion to yourself, rather than dismissing them with a name, with a word like that. We all want to know whether the crimes committed in the name of Islam are themselves, in some sense, a result of that faith. And that's a proposition we have to entertain and question. And the use of the word Islamophobia in the media has been largely to shut up that discussion.
And you have praised aspects of Islam in the past.
Oh yeah, I mean I'm very tender towards it, if you like. All human beings have a hunger for a religion and a desire to submit to something which pacifies our relations with others. And Islam has been brilliant at that. And that's the message. That the problem is that its peacemaking qualities aren't easily transportable from one place to another, and certainly not when it's transported into a community or political system which isn't based on faith and submission. And this is something that I think people need to discuss. In the old Ottoman Empire, there were many institutions and attempts to reconcile an overarching Muslim faith with all the sects which diverged from it. It wasn't always successful, we have to recognise, but the survival of all those Christian communities until recently was proof that it could work. But it's very different when a Muslim community exists as a minority within another, perhaps entirely secular civil order. Then the great question is, how does Islam adapt to that? And that is the question we all have to discuss, and we have to recognise that name calling is no help.
After you were sacked by the government, George Eaton, the New Statesman journalist who'd interviewed you, published a photograph of himself on Instagram drinking champagne from the bottle with the tagline, quote, "The feeling when you get right-wing racist and homophobe Roger Scruton sacked as a Tory government advisor," unquote. Do you think it was a premeditated hit job? And was giving an interview to George Eaton and the New Statesman foolish in retrospect?
It was foolish in retrospect. It was arranged by my publisher because it's my 75th birthday. They wanted to publicise. They reissued 3 of my books, and that's why I accepted the interview. I thought, okay, yeah, of course I'll give an interview to the New Statesman. I respect the journal because I wrote for it for many years as wine critic. But of course this young man who seemed perfectly reasonable, but was only there to record everything I said in order to extract the damning words, had another agenda. And it was clear the whole thing was malicious. And those words that he uses, a right-wing, racist, homophobic, those are in themselves slanderous and proof of the malice aforethought, which should this case ever come before a court of law, will be very hard to get round.
And are you thinking of going to law about this?
Yeah, I'm thinking of it.
So with the exception of your comment about the Chinese Communist Party, you'd said all of these things before, and they were all invoked by your critics who tried to get the government to sack you last November when you were appointed. Why do you think your critics were successful this time, but not in November?
It has a lot to do with the Brexit trauma. I think the government is incredibly sensitive to the fact that it might be subjected to a new load of criticisms, and it has manifestly failed to deliver what it promised to deliver to the people, and I think therefore is highly sensitive.
Do you think that the anti-Semitism scandal in the Labour Party is also a factor? Because the way Labour have tried to deflect criticism is to accuse the Conservative Party of being Islamophobic.
I think that's right. I think that has happened. My own view is that the Conservative Party is not particularly down on Islam or on Muslims generally. There is undeniably a huge suspicion and apprehension in the people about what Islam actually means in the modern world, and it isn't surprising, given the Manchester bombing and all the other things, that people wonder whether the government shouldn't be doing something to integrate the Muslim community. This has been one of my causes right from the beginning of my political awareness, and when I founded the Salisbury Review in 1982. The first thing that happened was that I got that famous letter from Ray Hunniford, headmaster in Bradford, about the difficulties he was having in maintaining a proper discipline in the classroom, given that the parents of the children were not committed to the integration of their children into the surrounding community. On the contrary, wanted always to take them back arbitrarily to Pakistan for this or that holiday, and to bring them up strictly in the Islamic faith, not recognising that there were any obligations to the surrounding community. And I think that I published that article, and that was the beginning of all the attacks on me. But I've always retained an interest in that question, how you reconcile Muslim communities to existence in a purely secular society like this, which is extremely a mature society with an education system and a legal order, both of which are founded entirely on secular principles, which have no equivalent in obviously in rural Pakistan. I think it's a really interesting question, and as I say, people are trying to prevent the discussion of it. Not everybody. I mean, there are Muslims who are very keen on opening this discussion, and I think if it's not opened at the highest level, this discussion will never occur.
In the New Statesman interview, and I'm assuming this quote is accurate, you said about the attempt to unseat you in November, what surprised me was the kind of people who repeated these allegations. You expect people who spend their lives on Twitter to have this store of malice, but when it comes up in Parliament, as it did, I was astonished, unquote. Do you think politicians in the UK and elsewhere have become more malicious in the past 4 or 5 years?
I wouldn't have said they are more malicious, but I think less intelligent. Most serious and intelligent people would realise that you don't get your information from Twitter in order to pursue some important political matter. But they all have Twitter accounts, and there's something childish and moronic about them now, which it's like entering a classroom of first-year university students who haven't yet learned how to put the iPhone down and pick up a book. What one does about that, I don't know.
How do you account for the extraordinary influence wielded by, for the most part, left-wing Twitter outrage mobs? Why is it that the government responded so swiftly and did the bidding of the mob without giving you an opportunity to explain what you'd said or to explain that some of these remarks had been taken out of context? Why did they just instantly capitulate?
Good question. The obvious answer, that they are cowardly and easily intimidated and want to preserve their careers rather than to confront the truth, is probably the right one. But why are they cowardly? What have they to fear? That is the great question. If our government, our Conservative government, were properly in touch with the conservative feelings of the electorate and had a proper, structured conservative philosophy with which to address those feelings, they wouldn't be afraid, because they could call people together and say, look, they're attacking us again in this stupid way. Let's go back to our principles and see what we think. And that's what the left do, of course. And part of the problem in my life, I suspect, is that I have more or less uniquely among academic philosophers actually offered to provide that structured philosophy. So I'm a huge embarrassment to the Conservative Party. I shouldn't exist, really.
To what extent do you think the climate of intolerance that seems to be sweeping the Anglosphere and some European countries to particularly France, to what extent is it due to a resurgence of hard left ideology?
I would be relieved if I thought it were due to that, because that would suggest there was some thinking behind it. The old hard left, as exemplified by the Soviet Empire, if we're still allowed to use the word empire, was founded in an extremely serious philosophical vision, the Marxist vision of history and of the class divisions of contemporary society. It was always illuminating to study it and to confront it and to ask myself the question, what is right in this, what is wrong in this, what should I think and what shouldn't I think? But that's gone. This so-called leftist, intolerant leftist position, which resurges all the time in the identity culture, does not have such an intellectual base. It doesn't reflect on the nature of the human condition or human history in that way. I don't know why it exists. It doesn't exist because of an intellectual argument. It exists obviously from deep emotional causes which have to do with resentment, feeling excluded and all that sort of thing, and then creating identities whereby to claim a new kind of inclusion. There are lots of deep psychological processes here, but they all seem to tend in the same direction, namely to target anybody who has the impertinence to defend his own inheritance, because he's defending a form of belonging which seems to exclude them.
So in the past I've been criticised for comparing the current climate of intolerance in the West to the atmosphere in Soviet-era Eastern Europe. So I read a piece recently for The Spectator talking about Milan Kundera's The Joke, and it being quite topical because people can now lose their livelihoods in Britain and America for making inappropriate jokes, just as the central character in the novel does. But people have accused me and others who make that comparison of trivialising the suffering that dissidents in communist regimes endured and still have to endure. And as someone who was an anti-communist activist who was detained in Czechoslovakia and deported in 1985, and who was awarded the Czech Republic's Medal of Merit by Václav Havel, what would you say the difference is? What are the points of similarity and the points of difference?
The first thing it recognises that under the Soviet system, the Communist Party had a monopoly of power and an ability to essentially punish any utterance that it didn't approve of, and that meant any criticism of the system, of the party, and so on. And this power to punish was not so severe in Eastern Europe as it was in Russia, where of course you could end up in the Gulag for some slight grammatical fault. In Eastern Europe, you just had to be careful about what you said, and careful about, if you wanted to publish anything, you'd have to clean it from any reference to the dissident culture. And most of the people I knew in those countries, in Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary, were used to this and they published in another way. This whole samizdat operation was very important to them. That's one of the things that I was involved in supporting. And actually, the samizdat press was, in some ways, freer than any press over here, because it didn't have to acknowledge the prevailing orthodoxy here either. So you could say just about what you want. When we started our underground university in Prague and Brno, I was always astonished to visit and lecture there, because coming from a university in Britain, I was just not used to the intellectual freedom that one had when one was working underground It was, I could never have said the things that I said in those talks in Prague, in the London University where I worked.
In his Sunday Times column on Sunday, the historian Neil Ferguson called for what he called a NATO of intellectuals and academics to defend intellectual freedom. The lesson of the Cold War is clear. He wrote, "From now on, an attack on one of us must be considered an attack on all of us. I therefore invite all who believe in the fundamental human freedoms to sign a non-conformist academic treaty." I mean, do you think a lack of solidarity amongst dissident intellectuals is one of the reasons it's become so easy for left-wing Twitter mobs to pick them off?
I'm sure that's true. I mean, I was picked off long before Twitter, as a result of that scandal over the Salisbury Review.
I was going to actually read back a quote to you about that, about becoming the founding editor of the Salisbury Review in 1982. You said, I think you wrote, "It cost me many thousands of hours of unpaid labour, a hideous character assassination in private eye, 3 lawsuits, 2 interrogations, 1 expulsion, the loss of a university career in Britain, unending contemptuous reviews, Tory suspicion, and the hatred of decent liberals everywhere." And you concluded by saying, "And it was worth it."
Well, there you are. I felt I had to conclude on a positive note, but I suspect that last sentence would be deleted now.
It's quite salutary to be reminded that the current climate of intolerance is not new, that it's always been a characteristic of the liberal West. But it seems to have taken on a slightly new and different character.
Yeah, this is something I'm really thinking about at the moment, because it's not based on any firm intellectual foundations. It's not like the Soviet case, which, although it was, of course, vulgarized and made ridiculous by the people who were charged with imposing it, that censorship had grown out of a genuine intellectual movement, which was still respected in my university, not respected in Eastern Europe. But one of the things that struck me when I used to travel to Poland and elsewhere to give lectures was that there the Marxism was treated with contempt. And I would often try and say, that don't forget there's important elements in this, and you've got to go back to it and trace it to its Hegelian roots, because that was a real attempt to understand human communities. Then I go back home to London, where of course Marxism was what was taught. And the contrast is extraordinary. Marxism was imposed as a kind of state orthodoxy there, but rejected completely as an intellectual enterprise by the people. And it was somewhat the opposite here.
Do you think someone starting a similar magazine to the Salisbury Review today would suffer a similar level of consequence, or do you think it would be worse?
It would be very different, because the Salisbury Review was aimed at educated people who read books and did think about these things in the long term and philosophically. Now, Twitter is not aimed at such people. Obviously, it sinks to the lowest denominator, as everybody knows, and rewrites the important issues of the day in a kind of staccato Mickey Mouse idiom that anyone can follow, usually with pictures. It's about all at the level of that tweet of George Eaton's that you referred to, the sort of thing that could be grasped by an ordinary malicious child, and that's new, and one has to try and understand where that comes from and why people brought up on that want to silence the discussion among others who have brains, and that's what's happened in universities. I would take the recent case of John Finnis. This is a very good illustration of the way in which the word homophobia is abused. Of course, John Finnis is the leading philosopher of law in this country. There's no doubt about it. He's a completely different level from everybody else. There was a letter of protest organised by graduate students in the law department, to calling for his dismissal, signed by 400 people, because apparently he wrote against gay marriage when it was first proposed, some 20 or 30 years ago, I think, on behalf of the Catholic orthodoxy about what marriage is. And this was enough to describe him as homophobic, as though he had some revulsion against homosexuality as such. He may have done, and I think he probably overstepped the mark. But if you can't overstep the mark, you can't discuss. You've got to feel free to say what you think, and you can then be rebuked and criticised, and you might want to change your mind. Changing your mind is the only sure sign that you've got one.
Oxford hasn't in any way bent in response to this petition, and it's been fairly robust until now.
That's good, yeah.
When confronted by Twitter outrage mobs. The same cannot be said of Cambridge, which extended the invitation to Jordan Peterson to give a series of lectures about the Bible as a visiting fellow later this year, and then withdrew the invitation as soon as there were some protests. Were you shocked that Cambridge should have behaved in quite such a cowardly way?
I was, and touch on my old experience in Eastern Europe. When we founded our underground university, you couldn't get any institution in the West to authenticate the degrees that we wanted to give to people, because that was offensive to foreign office policy and all the rest, a policy essentially of appeasement. But one place was prepared to endorse it, these degrees, and that was the University of Cambridge Divinity School, because it was founded in the Middle Ages independently of the university and had its own right, which had never been taken away, to give Cambridge degrees. So they said, yes, we'll do it. And they run it as a kind of theology university, under aegis of which you could do all the other things that people wanted to learn. And just before the Jordan Peterson case, the Czechs who'd gone through this, out of gratitude, created a plaque to put in the divinity school. So it had just been affixed to the wall, this record of the wonderful freedom, gift of intellectual freedom that the divinity school in Cambridge had conferred on the Czech and Slovak people. And then we heard the next day, or not quite the next day, but a few weeks on, that it was precisely the divinity school that wasn't able to cope with the presence of Jordan Peterson. And so it was a kind of indication of just how things have gone.
Yeah. Well, Sir Roger Scruton, thank you very much for talking to Quillette.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Quillette podcast. Quillette is where free thought lives. We are an independent grassroots platform for heterodox ideas and fearless commentary. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can do so by going to Quillette.com and becoming a paid subscriber. This subscription will also give you access to all our articles and early access to Quillette social events.